If you want to get your dogs some tasty, delicious, fresh baked pumpkin treats that are great for their digestion, visit beautiesbiscuits.com. We've got turmeric varieties, peanut butter, all natural peanut butter. Parsley helps with stinky dog breath. I actually grow it right in my yard. So this season I am harvesting my parsley.
Yay.
And making fresh dog biscuits for you. And I also have CBD. Great for senior dogs, dogs that are anxious, hip pain, joint pain. Turmeric and CBD is wonderful. I got all the things. Use offer code LIES and save 20% at beautiesbiscuits.com.
Do it. Do it.
Because your dogs will love you for it, and so will I.
This is Jackie Moranti, host of Cause of Death on the Darkcast network. On my show, we usually discuss war, death, destruction, and disease. And, as you can imagine, my tastes are a bit on the dark side. So when I shop for unique novelties and gifts, I always keep an eye out for something a little out of the ordinary. That's why I shop at Batwings and Butterflies. Batwings and Butterflies is an independent, creator-owned and operated boutique of handmade knit creations that run the gamut from the wild side to the dark side. Here, you'll find knit toys and stuffies like baby Baphomets and giant tarantulas, household knits like blankets, doilies, and water pipe cozies. Every item is an original work of art, handmade with love by a talented artisan. Order your one-of-a-kind creations today. Find Batwings and Butterflies at batwingsandbutterflies.bigcartel.com or on Instagram at Batwings and Butterflies. My favorite product is the giant tarantula, the perfect thing for cold nights in the New Mexico desert. After all, 8 arms are much better than just 2. It's the perfect snuggle while listening to Cause of Death, available wherever you listen to podcasts and on the Darkcast network.
I'm Edward October, creator-host of Octoberpod, and we're both listening to Calls of Death on the Darkcast network.
Cause of Death portrays imagery of death, war, and destruction. It may not be suitable for children under the age of 13. Hello, and welcome to Cause of Death. I'm your host, Jackie Moranti. This is the final episode in Season 3, The Perfectly Avoidables. This season explored several diseases that formerly killed a lot of people, and mumps, the one that didn't kill a lot of people, but had some pretty severe sequelae. I've talked about how vaccines have saved more lives and prevented more disease than quarantine and sanitation combined. Prevention is key, as we've seen with so many of the diseases I've covered. It wasn't until a vaccine was found for smallpox that the disease could be eradicated worldwide. Polio, diphtheria, measles, and rubella were endemic for centuries until vaccines were found. Now they're just shadows of a past. Unfortunately, it's a past that's been forgotten. And that's why I do this podcast. I want people to remember a time when smallpox killed more people than anything else, disease and non-disease related. Which brings us to today's episode. I'm going to talk about the modern anti-vaccination movement. During the smallpox episodes, I talked quite a bit about the anti-vax movement of the 18th and 19th centuries, but I want to talk about how that relates to now. So today I'm going to talk about Andrew Wakefield, Jenny McCarthy, and the movement that's allowing measles to rear its ugly head again. Andrew Wakefield and 12 of his colleagues published a paper in the medical journal The Lancet in 1998. The paper hypothesized that the MMR vaccine caused intestinal inflammation and also allowed harmful proteins to enter the brain, which caused autism. To support this, he found 12 children who were developmentally delayed. 8 of them had been diagnosed with autism 1 month after receiving the MMR vaccine. This paper was flawed. 2 reasons were later cited. The first was that Wakefield used 12 children that had the pre-existing conditions that he was seeking. At the time his research was published, 90% of the children in England had received the vaccine. The MMR vaccine is administered at the time in a child's life when autism is diagnosed, so it would be expected that there were children diagnosed with autism shortly after receiving the vaccine. Wakefield's study only included these 12 children. All had been vaccinated and all had developmental disorders. I'm saying this several times because it's super important to remember it. Now, we have to look at the children that Wakefield didn't choose for his study. 90% of children in England had received the vaccine at the time. Most of those children didn't have abnormal development. The children who were not diagnosed with any kind of developmental disorder were excluded from his research. He also did not include children from the 10% of unvaccinated children in England. He had no control group. You can't have good research without controls, and he never explored the incidence rate of unvaccinated children. His next flaw was that he only used 12 children for his research. Good research requires a much larger pool of subjects. Wakefield et al. Claimed that autism was a consequence of intestinal inflammation. However, in his group of children, the 8 that were diagnosed with autism were observed with intestinal symptoms after they were diagnosed, not before. Again, he chose 12 children with developmental delays. Only 8 of those children were diagnosed with autism. This study was retracted. That means that it is no longer a part of the scientific record. It was found that Wakefield had not conducted his research ethically. The data was misrepresented, and the study was deemed to be fraudulent. In 2002, Wakefield tried again. A second paper was published examining the relationship between measles virus and autism. In this experiment, the authors tested biopsy samples for the presence of measles virus in children with and without autism. 75 of the 91 children who had been diagnosed with autism were found to have measles virus in their intestinal tissues, compared with only 5 of 70 participants who did not have autism. Now, this would have been compelling evidence that Wakefield was correct, and there was some correlation between autism and the measles vaccine. Except again, his research was flawed. The measles vaccine is a live attenuated vaccine. Go back and listen to Season 1, the first Q&A, to find out what that means. Because it's attenuated, it can replicate about 15 to 20 times before being taken up by the antigen-presenting cells. These cells are mobile, so they'll travel throughout the body before they present to the immune system, and this includes traveling through the gut. This means that it's not only possible, but plausible that measles virus would be present in the intestinal samples after the child had been immunized, if the assay used to detect the virus was sensitive enough. The assay used to detect the virus in the samples was extremely sensitive. It often gave false positives. When any test has a tendency toward either false positives or false negatives, a confirmatory test should be performed. The paper doesn't mention the confirmation of false positives or what the confirmatory test was. Now, in order to present this research correctly, the children with autism and the children without autism should have had some identical markers. Firstly, they should have been matched for immunization status, and secondly, the time the immunization was given to each child should have been recorded. These times should have been identical between the time that the child had received the vaccine and the time that the child had the biopsy sample taken. All of this information was available to the investigators doing the research, but it was never recorded. This critical information was omitted from the paper. Natural measles is still circulating in England, even now. So it would be critical to Wakefield's experiment to determine whether or not the samples taken from the children were natural virus or attenuated virus from the vaccine. And this distinction could have been made, but again, investigators chose to ignore that. In most experiments, there is a blinding method. What this means is that the person conducting the testing should not know whether the sample they are testing is part of the test group or part of the control group. And no mention of the blinding method was ever made in the paper at all. When all was said and done, the papers were published. This set off a chain reaction of people who refused to vaccinate their children. And subsequently, following the release of the paper, 12,000 cases of measles were reported in the UK. This caused hundreds of children to be hospitalized, many of them with very serious complications and long-term illnesses caused by measles, including 3 deaths. Wakefield had his medical license pulled, and the papers were retracted. The authorities found that the most recent paper presented falsified data, omitted data, and that Wakefield had treated the children in his care with callous disregard. Biopsies are not painless procedures, and these were performed without cause. A stool sample would have sufficed. The final nail in his coffin was that none of his research could be replicated. None of it. Several researchers tried to replicate his findings, and none of them could. He tried to replicate his findings, and he couldn't. He later claimed that the combination measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine caused autism. So he tried to patent a freestanding measles vaccine. He's a gastroenterologist, for God's sake. He knows nothing about creating vaccines for anything. It's also important to remember that the MMR vaccine has been mandated in several states in the U.S. since 1963. The mandates for almost all of the U.S. began in the 1970s. It's a requirement now that children be vaccinated in almost every state in the U.S., even today. My point is that if the MMR vaccine caused any kind of developmental disorder, we would have found it 20 years before Wakefield started his research. The vaccine hasn't changed to this day except for the addition of the varicella vaccine. Percolate on that for a minute. Now, let's think about this. Andrew Wakefield was stripped of his title. He's no longer a doctor, thank God. But he's still making a ton of money off of the anti-vax crowd. His net worth hovers around $13 million. So he's not Bill Gates. But that's still more money than a man who has been discredited deserves to make from junk science. His film, Vaxxed, was pulled from the Tribeca Film Festival, but eventually found its way into independent theaters in the U.S. and Europe. He speaks on the Anti-Vaxx circuit, where he pushes his movement for roughly $65 a head. He's also got backing from one of the biggest natural medicine companies in the U.S. Joe Mercola, who has made millions selling snake oil and vitamins, donated $2.9 million to to Wakefield's cause in 2020. Wakefield isn't hurting for a guy who really likes to falsify documentation, and there are currently no laws to keep him from doing it. His gain is our loss, though. Since the year 2000, measles and rubella cases worldwide have been on the rise due to parents not vaccinating their children. A disease that was once considered eliminated in 2004 in the U.S. has seen a significant rise in cases in the U.S. and Europe, particularly in England, where Wakefield is originally from. So how did Andrew Wakefield get involved in vaccine research to begin with? He was a gastroenterologist. Well, he was approached by the attorney of a family whose child had been diagnosed with autism after receiving the MMR vaccine. He was paid by this attorney to find a connection between the vaccine and autism. I'll leave that right there. This whole story is well documented. There's no secret about it. Refer to the show notes for this episode for more information, including his retracted research papers. So, how does Andrew Wakefield continue to get speaking engagements and make movies? Well, he rubs shoulders with the rich and famous. Former President Donald Trump, who has been a staunch anti-vaxxer for many years, made a long and annoying speech about autism being an epidemic because of the MMR vaccine during his presidential campaign. Robert Kennedy also makes it his business to speak out against vaccination. He was the guy who started the conspiracy theory that the COVID vaccine had a microchip in it so that Bill Gates could track us all. Newsflash, neither the government nor Bill Gates really has the time to care what we're doing. They've got bigger fish to fry. Of course, fueling the fire at the conference in 2020 was Louisiana's state representative Danny McCormick, who claimed that the government overreach was killing the economy during the pandemic. He demanded that mask mandates be lifted along with quarantine restrictions at the time. Remember, this was just before Mardi Gras, which brings millions of dollars into the state of Louisiana each year. So not only do we have anti-vaxxers, but we also have anti-government conspiracy theorists in this movement. See a trend? Crazy on crazy? Now let's talk about the loudest mouth in the group. Jenny McCarthy is an actress, a celebrity, a pseudo-author, and a very misguided activist. Her son was diagnosed with autism when he was 2.5, and since then, she's been a very vocal part of the anti-vax movement. Jenny McCarthy has no expertise in the correlation between autism and the MMR vaccine. She has no education in science. She has never worked in a lab. She dropped out of nursing school when she was 19. She does, however, have a son with autism, which makes her an expert on how to raise a child with autism. But she has no idea why this child has autism. She has, however, published 3 books on the subject. These books have further fueled the fire of the non-existent connection between autism and the MMR vaccine. She once told a reporter that if she had another child, she would choose not to vaccinate. She would rather that her child came down with measles than autism. She claims that most parents with children who have autism would rather have their children have measles. This is a disease that causes deafness, blindness, congenital heart failure, and many times death. They say they would rather have that. Now, I'm not going to minimize autism. Autism can be challenging for parents. I'm absolutely sure of it. Maybe mothers of autistic children do believe that measles is better, but I can't see how. Of course, my child didn't have autism, so I don't have any experience as the mother of an autistic child. I have posted a link with an asterisk beside it to 2 videos that show what can happen when children develop natural measles infections. Go watch that. Anyway, Jenny said that her son came down with autism about a month after receiving the MMR vaccine. But she also said that she believes that the MMR wasn't the only cause. It was all vaccines. She claims that they give too many vaccines to children. Jenny McCarthy is the face of Generation Rescue. Essentially, this is a group that advocates for children with autism. It also educates the public against vaccines. Jenny also claims that if you take dairy and gluten out of a child's diet, they can recover from autism and they don't have to worry about getting any deadly disease. Removing these elements from their diet would somehow take the place of vaccines for prevention of any disease. How did she come by this valuable information? The University of Google. Yeah, not scientific papers either. She ignored the Mayo Clinic and the CDC and went straight to Andrew Wakefield. Generation Rescue hires Andrew Wakefield on a regular basis to speak at their functions. They still refer to him as Dr. Wakefield. Jenny McCarthy's claim is that researchers are too lazy to find safe vaccines. Vaccines are a hoax created by pharmas so that they can make millions of dollars. Newsflash, Jenny. Pharmas don't make anything on vaccines. Go listen to my episode on the Cutter incident. This is a terribly dangerous game. And Jenny McCarthy, Robert Kennedy, and Donald Trump not only have bought into the false science hook, line, and sinker, but they're spreading the word far and wide that vaccines are causing autism, changing our DNA, and yes, concealing microchips. They even suggest that we should have measles parties. Okay, so let's talk about valid research done on autism and the findings from that research. Let's begin by talking about what autism is. Now, I am not an authority on autism or any other developmental disorder, so I'm going to refer to the experts. I will quote directly from the National Institutes of Health. According to the National Institutes of Health, autism is defined as, quote, autism spectrum disorder is a neurological and developmental disorder that affects how people interact with others, communicate, learn, and behave. Although autism can be diagnosed at any age, it was described as a developmental disorder because symptoms generally appear in the first 2 years of life. They go on to say, according to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, a guide created by the American Psychiatric Association that healthcare providers use to diagnose mental disorders, people with ASD often have difficulty with communication and interaction with other people, restricted interests and repetitive behaviors, symptoms that affect their ability to function in school, work, and other areas of life. Autism is known as a spectrum disorder because there is a wide variation in the type and severity of symptoms people experience. People of all genders, races, ethnicities, and economic backgrounds can be diagnosed with ASD. Although ASD can be a lifelong disorder, treatments and services can improve a person's symptoms and daily functioning. The American Academy of Pediatrics recommends that all children receive screening for autism. Caregivers should talk to their child's health provider about ASD screening or evaluation. End quote. Now, before I go on, I'd like to take a minute to tell the story of the only child that I knew with autism. I was a school bus driver when I was in college. Bus driving fit with my schedule, and my daughter rode the same bus that I drove, so she could ride the entire route with me, or I could just drop her off at home after school. And the same with before school. There was one little boy on the bus. I believe he was in 2nd or 3rd grade. It's been a while, so I don't remember all my details. Anyway, this child was just brilliant. He would sit on the bus and draw for the entire ride. And he was my last stop, so sometimes he would be on that bus for a couple hours. He drew some of the most amazing pictures, mostly of cartoon characters. His favorites were the oldies: Foghorn Leghorn, Bugs Bunny, and Wile E. Coyote and the Roadrunner. I could have limited conversations with this kid. He was a crack-up, too. I could ask him a question, and he would answer in the voice of one of the cartoon characters. Sometimes it would be Bullwinkle or Rocky, sometimes Foghorn Leghorn, and sometimes it would be a character that I didn't know. But he would answer me and give a very straightforward, sensible answer. Sometimes it would be a little sarcastic, and that voice was usually Bugs Bunny or Porky Pig. One day he was getting off the bus on a Friday, and I said, "Okay, Bobby, we'll see you Monday." And I'm not sure whose voice answered me, but he said, "I don't ride the bus on Mondays." Maybe Mr. Magoo? I tried to answer in the same voice, and I probably failed miserably, but I said, "Okay, I'll see you Tuesday then." He smiled a huge smile, laughed like Woody Woodpecker, and got off the bus to go home. He was absolutely adorable. But I was just his bus driver. I didn't have to deal with him when he got home. I just saw this wonderful, brilliant child who spoke in cartoons. His name wasn't Bobby. I do remember his name, but I don't want to compromise his identity by saying it here. That was almost 20 years ago, and I still remember that child's name. He had that much personality. Every day that he rode my bus, he made my day. And I always had lousy Mondays. Okay, back to research. Several studies have been done to show that the MMR vaccine is in no way responsible for autism. In 1999, Brent Taylor and his team examined the relationship between autism and the MMR vaccine. This study examined the records of 498 children who were diagnosed with either autism or an autism-like disorder in both vaccinated and unvaccinated children. These children were identified by records dating back before the vaccine was available in the UK and included children after the vaccine became available in 1988. His study found that the incidence of autism was the same in vaccinated children as it was in unvaccinated children. There was no age difference at the time of diagnosis between vaccinated and unvaccinated children. And the onset of autism did not occur within 2, 4, or 6 months of receiving the MMR vaccine. It's important to note that this study has been replicated by other groups. Between 1991 and 1998, Madsen and colleagues performed one of the best studies on the correlation between autism and the MMR vaccine in Denmark. The study included 537,303 children and represented 2,129,864 person-years of study. Approximately 82% of the children in this study had received the MMR vaccine. These children were selected from the Danish Civil Registration System. Their vaccination status was obtained from the Danish National Board of Health. The children with autism were identified from the Danish Central Register. Madsen and co-workers found that the risk of autism in the group of vaccinated children was no different than in the group of unvaccinated children. They also found that there was no connection between the time of vaccination, the time since vaccination, or the date of vaccination and the development of autism. Again, other studies have corroborated these findings. This study had several key factors for a scientific experiment. There was a control group, the unvaccinated children. There was a large study pool, and the experiment was repeatable by another group that had no conflict of interest. There are continuing studies using home movies that are of interest in the timing of autism symptoms. Everyone loves to take videos of their kids when they're little. So a group of researchers asked parents to share the home movies that they took of their kids from infancy to their first birthday. These investigators found that there were markers of autism in children in early infancy. The markers were subtle, but they were there. The markers were evident in infants as young as 2 to 3 months of age. These studies not only refuted the claim that MMR vaccine causes autism, but they are also currently being used to study other cases of autism. Now, let's think about some things that could cause autism with the understanding that more research on this disorder is being done every day. And we have to remember that there might not be a single cause, but possibly several causes. The first one I'll talk about is genetics. Studies involving identical and fraternal twins are common when trying to determine a genetic link to a particular disease or syndrome. Studies have been done using a very strict definition of autism, and the studies use twins who were diagnosed with autism. Among identical twins, approximately 60% of the time, the twin is also diagnosed with autism. In fraternal twins, the twin is diagnosed with autism 0% of the time. When researchers used a broader definition of autism, autism spectrum disorder, these rates rise to approximately 92% in identical twins and 10% in fraternal twins. This means that autism has some genetic basis. Autism could also be caused by structural abnormalities of the nervous system in the womb. This could be caused by the mother taking certain medications during the first or early second trimester of pregnancy. Other environmental exposures have also been considered. Unclean water, contaminated food, preservatives, and other things that we tend to expose ourselves to. And many times we don't even know we're exposing ourselves to it. Autism is also known to be caused by natural rubella infection. If you've listened to the last episode on rubella, it's a major factor in several birth defects among children whose mothers had contracted the disease while pregnant. One of those is autism. I encourage you to take a look at the Autism Science Foundation website for more information on studies that are currently being done to explore the causes of autism. This foundation also oversees the validity of experiments and ensures that studies like the ones Andrew Wakefield did are not repeated. I've put their link in my show notes. Okay, so that's Andrew Wakefield and the Tinfoil Hat Club. The anti-vax movement has been around for centuries. If you go back and listen to the smallpox episodes, I talk about Benjamin Franklin being a staunch anti-vaxxer until one of his children died of smallpox. After that, he decided that vaccination was probably a better road to go down. I really wanted to do an episode on Andrew Wakefield to show that poor judgment and bad science are real things. Sometimes unethical behavior goes unchecked, and it slips by the regulatory agencies that are supposed to catch these things before they're published. It happened with a paper that was published during the COVID pandemic. The paper showed that ivermectin was a cure for COVID-19. That paper was pulled shortly after publication in a major medical journal, but it wasn't caught in time to keep the anti-vaxxers from getting a hold of it. You can't even find that paper now, but there is a website that directs you to all the people who had collaborated on that paper. There are people out there who are unethical. There are researchers who fabricate data, cut corners, and generally just don't follow the rules because it's easier not to. There are also laws and regulatory agencies in place to catch them before things get out of hand. They're all caught eventually. Sometimes it takes a few years, but they do get caught. Another reason I wanted to take a look at Wakefield is that I wanted to point out that the anti-vaccination movement that exists now has existed since time out of mind. It's been around forever. Mark Twain once said, quote, "A lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is still putting on its shoes," end quote. That's the way it's always been. So, what can we do? How can we promote better information? First of all, trust is vital. It's why I do so much research and I have 4 pages of show notes for you. I want you to be able to see what I've read and know that you can trust my findings. This also means that healthcare providers must be able to give sound advice on vaccines. They have to be trustworthy and speak to their patients in a way that conveys facts without being pretentious. Second, researchers and regulatory agencies must double down when it comes to catching the sloppy science. Integrity of evidence is one of the best and most important ways to convey information to healthcare providers. They depend on good science to give them a basis for guiding their patients. Wakefield wasn't disciplined for scientific fraud until 2010, even though he was exposed in 2004 when his co-authors retracted their papers. That means that his papers were out for 12 and 10 years, respectively. Sloppy science needs to be disciplined much quicker. The people working on publications need to be examined on a regular basis, not just when a whistle is blown or there is a suspected problem. Catch it before it becomes a problem. Third, the media has a responsibility to provide accurate information on any subject they choose to speak about. It's my responsibility also. It's true that the First Amendment gives me certain rights, but with rights come personal responsibility to provide sound information and do no harm. Fourth, public health officials must ensure that public health policies are being enforced. Government agencies make the laws. They need to make sure people follow them. The government needs to stop waffling politics. This isn't about votes. It's about public health. Lastly, stop getting your information from memes on Facebook. Just stop it. Anyone can make a meme. It takes a lot of work to put out good information. It comes down to this. If we all do a better job of sifting through the garbage, we'll all be better off. This is the conclusion of Season 3 on the Perfectly Avoidables. Season 4 starts in 2 weeks. In that season, I'm going to talk about the moldy oldies. Cholera, plague, typhoid fever, maybe a little tuberculosis for good measure, and a ton of history. Of course, I'm going to throw in 1 or 2 100 Seconds to Midnight episodes, so it should be an interesting season. With that, I want to thank all of you for listening to Cause of Death. Please check the show notes for all the ways that you can support the show. And while you're there, take a look at a few of the links I posted. It's why I do show notes, so you guys can check my work. Please don't forget to rate, subscribe, review, and share. Your geeky friends really want to listen to this show. I promise. I'll see you in 2 weeks.